A very good afternoon to all my dear students. How are you all? So welcome to today's session, which is the last session for chapter number 4, which is audit evidence. So students, as we have already, discussed it earlier also that this is a very important chapter and the weightage is 12 to 18%. So from the part of your understanding as well as for the purpose of preparing for your exams, right? So theoretically also it is important and practical implications also when you will come across your, the various activities relating to auditing, you will see that whatever we are studying in this chapter, you are going to, use all that thing only, right? So very important chapter. So students, I hope that in the last session, I have asked you to go through essay 530, which is the last topic which is left in this chapter. I hope you have done that. And apart from essay 530, we have covered the entire chapter. So I expect that you all have gone through your module in entirety, including the illustrations and the questions relating to those topics. And in case you have any doubt, any query relating to the topics that we have already covered, you can always send in your queries, right? So send in your queries if any, and meanwhile I'll share the screen. So we'll be starting with the last essay of this chapter, which is essay 530. Right? So let me just have a look at your responses. Sejal, good afternoon. Others also please send in your queries if any. So students, when we were studying essay 500, which was audit evidence, this was the paragraph as is reflected on your screen that I have left at that moment. And I told you that whenever we'll be starting with essay 530, I'll complete this topic also, right? So see, essay 500 requires the auditor to obtain audit evidence, right? And when the auditor obtains the audit evidence, he selects various items for testing, right? He's going to check the financial statements, and let's say he's going to check the internal controls also. He's going to examine the internal controls also. That is, he may perform test of controls and he will perform what substantive procedures, right? Now, when the auditor is performing all these tests, he'll select certain items that are to be tested. For example, let's say there are 1 lakh sales transaction. Now, whether to check all those sales transaction, whether to select certain specific item, or whether to apply audit sampling, it all depends upon auditor's professional judgment, the way he wants to, obtain audit evidence with respect to the particular assertion, right? So the means available to the auditor, and where is it given? It is given in essay 500, right? So he can select all the items, or he may select specific items, or he may apply what audit sampling. So see, when the auditor selects all the item, so basically it is possible when the number of items are small, the number of population is small, and it is, let's say, large value items, right? Or where there is significant risk, checking the transaction on sample basis won't provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. It is a significant risk, right? So auditor may go for 100% checking, right? Same way, if the system by which such transactions are controlled, if that system is automatic and it, it you can say it supports the checking of 100% transaction, it makes that checking process cost effective, then also auditor may go for 100% checking, right? And the another means, or the another option available for auditor is selecting specific items. Like auditor may select items having high value, or certain key items, that is certain important items, right? So let's say he say, okay, out of the sales transactions, okay, this 10 lakh, this 15 lakh, this 20 lakh wala invoice I'm going to check. Or let's say these invoices relating to the related parties, or let's say relating to this particular debtor I'm going to check. So certain specific items, right? And it can be what, all items over a certain amount. So let's say auditor decides that with respect to sales, every invoice above 50,000, or every balance of the trade receivables above 50,000 I'm going to check, right? or items to obtain certain information. So let's say the auditor wants to obtain information with respect to particular parties. So the invoice relating to that particular party auditor may check, right? So first we have seen he may check all the transactions or all items, then selecting the specific items depending upon the auditor's professional judgment. And last but not the least is what? Your audit sampling, right? So auditor may follow the sampling techniques. So students, I'm saying auditor may do this. Auditor may do this. So tell me, is it obligatory for an auditor to opt for audit sampling? Quickly send in your replies. So the topic that we have just discussed is given on page number. Just a minute. Page number 4.29 of your module, and now I am going to page number 4.44 for essay 530. Tell me, is it appearing to be obligatory for an auditor to opt for audit sampling? Send in your replies. So the answer is no, right? So it is as such not obligatory for the auditor, to, so Tanu is saying no. Others also please reply. Yes, so Rihanna is also saying no, it is not obligatory. But when the auditor is, using audit sampling, right? In that case, he should, follow the standards. He should follow the techniques as are given by SA 530, right? So see, this is about audit sampling, right? And we will be discussing about this in detail. Now, what is the traditional approach? So traditional approach is when the auditor is checking all the transactions. Now, when the auditor checks all the transaction, right? So it is basically considered as economically wasteful. Why? Because auditor is devoting his time and resources towards checking 100% of the transactions without any exception. Right? He's checking even the smallest and the immaterial transactions also, right? And also, student, nowadays, there are formal internal controls that are there in the organization. Chances of routine errors and frauds is very less. So checking all transaction is, not recommended. And in fact, the auditor, he should concentrate on checking, or he should give his more attention towards the question of principles and control, right? So he should, consider the controls that have been implemented and whether the principles have been followed or not. And there should be a curtailment of non-consequential routine checking. So the word used in a module is non-consequential, that is illogical routine checking. Routine is what? When you're checking the 100% transactions, right? And auditor may go for what? Audit sampling, right? And in fact, students, when you are checking all the transaction, that is when you are, following the traditional approach of checking all the transaction and not going by audit sampling, tell me, is materiality taken care by the auditor or no? Yes or no? Quickly send in your replies. See, when you're checking all the transaction, so is it happening that you are giving your more time towards the material transaction? No. Why? Because you are checking all the transaction and you are devoting your time and energy towards all the transaction, be it material and be it not material. But let's take another example. Let's say with respect to audit sampling. Now, auditor is selecting the, samples in such a way that the material transactions are being considered, right? Or let's say he uses stratification, right? So materiality will be considered there. Now, what is stratification? We will do as and when the topic will come, right? So what is the relevant essay with respect to audit sampling? It is essay 530, and the name of this essay, just a minute. So the name of this essay is what? Audit sampling, right? Now, audit, to you all know what is audit? It is an independent examination of financial information of any entity, whether profit oriented or not, irrespective of its size or legal form, right? Remember, when such an examination is conducted with a view to expressing an opinion thereon. Quickly send in your replies who all remember this definition. You have done this in your like chapter number 1, and this is the foundation of your understanding this subject. Tell me who all remember this definition. So what is audit sampling? So basically, when the auditor is, resorting to audit sampling, what is he doing? So let's say there are 1 lakh sales transactions, right? Now, instead of checking the entire sales transaction, what auditor is doing, let's say he selects a sample of 10%, right? And on that 10% only, he is going to, apply his audit procedures. And whatever results he is going to obtain with respect to that 10% of the, population is what? The sales transaction. What are the sampling units? That 10% that he has selected. On that 10%, he's going to apply the audit procedure. And whatever results he's going to obtain with respect to that 10%, he's going to project that on the entire population of 1 lakh sales transaction, right? So this is the very basic example. Keeping in mind this example, just read this definition and see, when the auditor selects the sample, he'll make sure that the sample should be representative of the entire population, right? So let's say if I am, I have to, see whether that 1 lakh sales transaction, 1 lakh is the number of the sales transaction, whether they reflect true and fair view or not. I'll select a sample out of that. And unless and until that sample is a true representative of the entire population. So let's say I select a sample and that sample consists of 10% of the transaction of total transactions, right? But that sample consists of sales made to only one party. All the sampling units consist of sale made to one party. So is it representative of the entire population? Answer is no, right? So auditor should make sure that the sample that has been selected, it is representative of the entire population. And each and every item that is selected in the sample is what? Sampling unit. And auditor applies the audit procedure on those sampling unit. I hope this is clear. So what is audit sampling? It is the application of audit procedures to less than 100% of items. So 100% was 1 lakh. This is what I told you, number of sales transaction. So less than this is what? 10% in our case, right? Within a population. So what is the population? The sales transaction relevant under audit, such that all sampling units. So this 10% is what? The sample selected, and each unit of this sample is what? The sampling unit have equal chance of selection. So each and every unit should have the equal chance of selection, right? That is what is sampling units. I told you all items. The items that make up the population is the sampling unit, and out of that 10%, if you select, that becomes what? Your sample, right? So I think I said that it is the, I think I said by mistake that it is the sample, but it is what? All the items that are there in the population are what? The sampling units, right? So application of audit procedures to less than 100% of items within a population relevant under audit, such that all sampling units, that all 1 lakh transaction that have there in the population, they have equal chance of selection, right? And and when I say that they have equal chance of selection, I mean to say that such items should represent the entire population. So it should not happen that sales relating to, or let's say trade receivables transaction, if I've taken, so pertaining to one particular receivable, it is coming. It should not happen like that, right? So what is the objective of SA 530? So basically, see, the conclusions that I'm going to draw with respect to this 10%, I'm going to project on this 1 lakh, right? So what is the objective? To provide a reasonable basis to draw conclusions about the population from which sample is selected. So basically, I'm going to, I'm going to draw the conclusion with respect to the entire population, right? And I'll be, performing the audit procedure with respect to that sample that has been selected. And each item of the population is what? Your sampling unit. So students, if you remember, I told you that the means of selecting the items for tested is contained in SA 500, right? So there is a line in your module which says that, just a minute. See, SA 530 complements SA 500. Why? Because it is mentioned in SA 500 that the auditor may, as a means of selecting the item, opt for audit sampling. And SA 530 further explain as to how to conduct audit or how to apply audit sampling, right? So are these, basic things clear to all of you? Are these clear? So what is population? Population is the entire set of data. Just a minute. It is the entire set of data from which the a sample is selected and about which the auditor wishes to draw the conclusions. So students, I'm repeating it again here that sampling units are all the units of your population. Out of those, you select a sample and on those sample you are going to apply your audit procedures, right? And the sample should be such that it should be representative of the entire population. Now when we say population, so there are certain characteristics of the population as are given in your module. So what are those populations? So population, say what we understand that if we are checking the sales transactions, so the entire 1 lakh sales transaction becomes the population, right? Now such sales transactions, such population from which we are going to check, or we are going to select the sample, it should be appropriate. Such population should be complete, and such population should be reliable. So when I say that it should be appropriate, so it should be appropriate for the specific audit procedure why I'm applying that audit procedure, right? So let's say if I have to check the whether the trade receivables are overstated or not. So I want to check, or let's take the example of trade payables, right? Your creditors. So I want to check whether they are overstated or not. Tell me what will be the appropriate population in that case? So it will be the entire list of the trade payables. I'll ask the management to provide me with the list of all the trade payables, and then I'll check whether they are overstated. That is, I'll check their genuineness. There should not be any fake trade payable, right? So that becomes my population. Now, when I have to check the understatement of trade payables, that trade payable should not be understated. I want to check this, right? In this case, students, the list from the management with respect to the trade payables, that is not going to be the appropriate population. But the subsequent disbursements, right? Any unpaid invoices, right? Subsequent is what? Let's say after the year, after the close of the year, certain payments have been made. From there, I'll be able to arrive at what, if any of the trade payable is understated. Because understated means that has not been recorded in the books of accounts. So how can I obtain, audit evidence from the things that have been recorded in the books of account? Because I have to check what, understatement. But yes, if I have to check overstatement, then from the recorded items, I can check, okay, this is the recorded item. Let me check whether it is genuine or not. But understatement mein to something has not been recorded. So from the recorded data, I cannot, trace it. But yes, from subsequent, if any payments are made after the end of the year, any unpaid invoices are there, any supplier statements are there, I can definitely consider it as the appropriate population. So whether that population, whether that data that you have from which you're going to select the sample, whether that is appropriate or relevant. And completeness. So unless and until the entire population is there with you, that is, you have the complete data, you cannot obtain a reliable sample from that, right? Then is reliable again means it should be accurate, right? So you will see the accuracy, the source, in order to see whether it is reliable or not, because unless and until your population is reliable, you cannot obtain a reliable sample on which you are going to apply the audit procedures, right? So I hope it is clear. And sampling unit, as we have discussed, that these are the individual items that make up the population. right? And audit procedures are applied on sampling units. Conclusions are drawn from them. Such conclusions are projected on the entire population. So conclusion on the sample becomes the conclusion with respect to the entire population, right? So that is why we say that sample must be representative. And students, we will see that there are two approaches to sampling, that is statistical approach, that is the scientific one, and non-statistical approach. So be it a statistical approach or be it a non-statistical approach, the sample must be representative. Is it clear? Is it clear? Send in your replies. Let me just have a look at your queries. So students, please tell me whether it is clear or not. Okay. Now there are uh, two approaches to sampling, which is statistical and non-statistical, right? Non-statistical is what? Your judgmental sampling. So whereby the auditor is applying his, experience and his knowledge in order to select the sample, right? And statistical sampling is what? See here, this is the approach to sampling whereby there is random selection of sampling units based on certain, mathematical laws, right? And then there is use of probability theory to evaluate that sample. So first of all, there is random selection of sample units based on certain mathematical laws and formulae. Then there is use of probability theory to evaluate such samples, right? And it includes the consideration of sampling risk also. What is sampling risk? So let's say, let me just take this topic of sampling risk, though it is not given in your, the material that is given in your module, but if you check the questions that are given at the end, there is one topic relating to sampling risk. Now, we have done this sampling risk earlier also when we were doing detection risk. If you remember in chapter number 3, tell me, do you remember? So sampling risk basically is the risk that the result that you have obtained by applying the audit procedure to the sample is different from the results that you would have obtained if you have applied those audit procedure on 100% of the population. So let's say when you have applied your audit procedure on 10% of that sample that we have taken in our earlier example. So let's say you applied your audit procedure on 10% of the entire population, that is on the sample. And you are of the view after applying your audit procedure on that sample that the sales transaction reflect a true and fair view, right? Now, vis-a-vis the situation that if you have applied those audit procedures on the entire population, on the entire 1 lakh transaction, you would have concluded that the sales transaction in fact do not reflect a true and fair view. So your conclusion when you apply the audit procedures to a sample is different from your conclusion when you apply the audit procedure to the entire population. This is what is called sampling risk, right? So when we apply statistical sampling, when we follow the statistical sampling approach, first of all, there is random selection of, sampling units. Then there is use of probability theories to evaluate the samples. And then such a sampling risk is also being measured, right? And such system is more scientific. It uses the mathematical laws of, probability. And where there are large number of similar items, right? Such approach has been followed. And since you are using the mathematical laws, and you are using the random selection of sample units, and there are use of probability theory to evaluate the samples, as such, there is no personal bias. So wherever there are huge number of huge transactions, such approach has been followed by the auditors, right? So I gave example of, let's say 1 lakh transactions are there. You are going to, use what? Statistical sampling, right? So what are the various methods by which you may, select the sample that we will discuss as and when they'll come in the chapter. What is non-statistical? So it is basically where the sample size and what will constitute the sample, right? So all the units of the sample and the sample size, it is based on auditor's personal experience and the knowledge that the auditor has, right? So though it is common and simple, but again, what it is, there is no objectivity. It is not scientific. Risk of personal bias is there. And it can be possible that, let's say, with respect to 1 lakh sales transaction, the auditor, based on his personal experience and knowledge, he decides a sample that, okay, the first and last transaction of every month I'm going to take, this transaction I'm going to take, and then he selects a sample of, let's say, 4,000 transactions, right? Now, since auditor has applied his personal knowledge and experience, he has not applied any, random number tables or anything like that. So there is what risk of personal bias, and it can be possible that the sample is not representative. So maybe the sample may not be representative of the entire population, right? So these are the various disadvantages of non-statistical sampling. Though, what are the various advantages? It is common, simple, and when the auditor is, applying non-statistical sampling. See, if you remember, I told you that the sample must be representative, be it statistical approach, be it non-statistical approach. So when the auditor is applying non-statistical sampling, his efforts will be to ensure that the sample is representative of the entire population. So he'll try to avoid any particular pattern for selection. So it should not happen that the management is aware that this particular auditor na, he has a tendency to check every first and last transaction of the month. He has a tendency to check every first 5 transaction of every month. So he will make sure that element of surprise is there, right? And there is a normal tendency whereby the, whenever a sample is selected on such basis, so the transactions near the end close of the financial year, they are checked in detail, because there is a tendency, or you can say they are more prone to manipulation, right? Is it clear? So is the statistical approach and non-statistical approach clear? And which method is to be used? It all depends upon auditor's professional judgment. Is it clear? So student, there is a topic on page number 4.50, which I want all of you to, just go through as a homework. You are supposed to go through the entire topic that we are covering today, but this topic is a summary of what we have just discussed, sampling versus the traditional method of auditing. So this is basically sampling versus 100% checking. So just go do this as a homework. And here I would like to take this topic, that what are the factors that the auditor has to consider when he's deciding upon the extent of checking of the sampling plan, checking on a sampling plan. So what should be the extent of checking? Tell me what, according to you, can be the factors. See, Tanu is saying, ma'am, if creditor is understated and management have no appropriate explanation, then auditor will perform, other alternative procedures, and still he is unable to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. Then, depending upon whether that, particular assertion that he's checking, that particular item that he's checking, whether it is material or pervasive or not, he's going to have, this is going to have an impact on his audit report, depending upon the nature of that, misstatement or whatever understatement. Tanu, is it clear? So I asked you that what, according to you, are the factors that are going to have an impact on the extent of checking on a sampling plan. So see, what extent of checking will be there, it depends upon various factors, like what is the size of the organization under audit. So let's say it is a very small organization, only 10 transactions are there. So are you going to, opt for this sample checking? Maybe no, you may go for 100% checking. So size of the organization under audit. Then state of internal control, obviously whether the internal controls are effective or not, that is going to, we always say that is going to have an impact on the nature, timing, extent of audit procedures. And when we say extent of audit procedure, it basically means what? The extent of checking, right? The adequacy and reliability of books and records, right? Tolerable error range. So what is the range of error that the auditor is going to tolerate? Right? So when I say error, so let's say in other terms, what is the range of misstatement that the auditor is okay with, he's going to tolerate? Tell me, if auditor, the tolerable error range of the auditor is high, that okay, I'm going to, accept this error range. So it is high. Tell me what will be the impact on the extent of checking. The checking will be high or low. If you are okay with you a higher, error range. So the extent of checking will be high or low. Tell me. You are saying that I'm going to, I'm okay with, let's say, 100 mistakes in this entire population of, let's say, 1,000 items. So when the tolerable error range is high, right? So auditor can, decrease his sample size. But when the tolerable error range is low, that is, he's not going to tolerate even a mistake of rupees 2 or 3. Obviously, his checking is going to increase. The sample size is going to increase. This particular topic we will just discuss in detail. There is a specific topic with this, so I'll take up there. And then the degree of desired confidence. Higher the confidence the auditor wants with respect to a particular assertion, higher the sample size he's going to take, and vice versa. Is it clear? Is it clear? Now, what are the various advantages of statistical approach, right? So appropriateness of sampling approach. So what are the various advantages of statistical sampling? So we all have seen that there is what? No personal bias, right? There is a use of probability theories, selection of sample using the random number tables, using the mathematical laws, and you also take into account the sampling risk that may come, right? So considering all these points which we have discussed, let us now have a look at the advantages of statistical sampling quickly. So see, when we apply statistical sampling, the results are measurable with, adequacy and reliability. Since no personal bias and, no personal judgment of auditor as such is involved, he's using the formulae, he's using the probability theories, so the results are measurable with adequacy and reliability. And when there is an increase in population, the entire population, so it is not necessary to increase the sample size. Why? Because you are using, let's say, the formulae to, derive the samples. So when there is an increase in the entire population that you are going to check, that need not be complemented with an increase in the sample size. You may go for with the, a smaller sample size also. It need not be increased in proportion to the increase of the size of the entire population that you are going to check, right? Then sample selection becomes objective and defensible. Why objective is what? Unbiased. Why defensible? Let's say in future there is a certain case of negligence on the auditor, whereby he's been asked that he has not conducted or he has not selected the, sample in an objective manner. So he can always, say that, see, I applied this statistical sampling approach, right? So it becomes defensible. Minimum sample size can be taken along with the specified risk. So using the formulae and, the various probability theories and mathematical laws, auditor, he may, after considering that what sampling risk he is ready to bear, he may select a minimum sample, right? So calculating the risk and the precision is what? The accuracy with which he wants the result. So when you are applying, just a minute, accuracy, right? Precision is what? Accuracy. So when the auditor is applying the statistical approach, he can, use the various formulae whereby he can put in as to this is the sampling risk that I can bear, and this is the accuracy with which I, want the result. So what should be the sample size, right? So since a minimum sample size having regard to the risk, having regard to the precision, that is accuracy, can be derived when the auditor is, applying this statistical sampling, right? And it is a better description of a large mass of data. So when the volume of data is high, following statistical sampling approach is better, and there is no personal bias. So these are what your advantages, which we have already discussed also. So Sejal, your doubt is not clear? Sejal, your doubt is not clear to me. Please reframe it. So is it clear? Students, tell me, is the topic clear, whatever we have done? So basically, students, the crux is that when the auditor is, Dhanush, I'm taking up your doubt. So when the auditor is applying the statistical approach, he is, he's using a scientific approach, whereby he is using the formulae or the mathematical laws in order to select the sample. That sample is also evaluated using various laws of probability, and he's taking into account the risk that he want to take, because such calculation is possible with respect to statistical approach, and he's also taking into account the precision, the accuracy with which he wants the data. So when statistical approach is been followed, all these things are possible. That if I want to take this calculated risk, if I want this accuracy, what should be the minimum sample size? So he is, each and every step is being performed using certain formula or mathematical calculations or your probability theories. So it is all scientific. There is no place for personal bias. But when the auditor is, using non-statistical approach, so in this case, auditor is applying his professional judgment, his knowledge and experience to select the sample, to evaluate the sample also. And the 100% accuracy or, consideration of calculated risk or the precision is not there, right? Is it clear, Dhanush, the difference? Acha, Sejal is saying it's clear. Dhanush, is it clear? He's saying clear. ठीक है. So we have seen the various, benefits of this sampling, statistical sampling also, right? Now, when we talk about the sampling process, so what exactly the process will look like? So first of all, just keep in mind a situation that you are conducting the audit of ABC Limited, whereby you saw that there are, 1 lakh sales transactions. Now, tell me 1, 2, 3, and 4, what all steps come to your mind when you are sampling or you are selecting a sample out of, or you are applying audit sampling when you are checking what? Such sales transactions. Tell me what steps come to your mind. Send in your replies. Select the population, Rihanna is saying. Size of transaction, Tanvi is saying. Then, so Sejal, my question was that when I say that you are applying a sampling process to, let's say, 1 lakh of the sales transaction, so what will be your steps? So first of all, you will consider the sample design, right? So when I say sample design, so I can see that many of you have written that we will select the population. So Rihanna, that will come in your sample design. Then, so Rihanna said selecting the population. So that will come where? In sample design. So auditor is going to design the sample, that this part of the population or this particular population, out of this I'm going to, consider the sample, I'm going to take out my sample, right? And when the sample has been decided, see, obviously the auditor will see now as to what audit procedure he wants to apply, the way we have discussed understatement and overstatement of accounts payable. So accordingly he is going to design that sample. We will discuss all these one by one, but let us just have a look at all these steps quickly. Sample size, then what should be the sample size, right? And when the auditor is, selecting the sample size, his efforts will be to ensure that the sample size should be such that so as to reduce the sampling risk to an acceptably low level. Now, what is sampling risk? I hope it is clear. So the sample size auditor will determine in such a way such that the sampling risk is reduced to an acceptably low level, right? Then what will be the sample selection method? And I think one of you has written about this also, sampling method. Rihanna has written this. So another step will be what? Sampling selection method, right? Then once this sample has been, taken out, auditor is going to apply the audit procedure on that sample, as we have already discussed also, right? And if there is any deviation or misstatement, auditor will consider the nature and cause of deviation. Now, let's say out of the sample of 1,000, with respect to 10 transactions, auditor found that there is a misstatement. Now, what is the difference between the term deviation and misstatement? Students, see, whenever the auditor is performing test of controls or substantive procedure, he may go for sampling, right? So, and in fact, there is one topic also, just a minute, in your module, just a minute. Oh, okay, just a minute. So when can auditor apply sampling process? When he is performing test of control or when he's performing what? Test of details. So now do you all know what is meant by test of control? When the auditor is checking the internal controls, and what is meant by test of details when the auditor is checking the financial statement. Now, when the auditor checks the, internal control and he finds that there is any, difference between what is expected out of that internal control and what the actual position is, that is called as deviation. So with respect to internal control, auditor finds what? Deviation, right? And with respect to financial statement, we call it as misstatement. So this is the only difference between the, the nomenclature. So one is what? Deviation, one is what? Misstatement. Deviation is with respect to the internal control, and the misstatement is with respect to financial statements. And auditor may, use this sampling process with respect to performance of test of control as well as test of details. ठीक है, इतना clear है? Now what we were discussing, huh. So nature and cause of deviation or misstatement. So let's say, take an example of misstatement, that out of, sample of 1,000, he finds that 10 transactions, there is certain misstatement, right? So now he is going to, consider as to what is the nature of that misstatement. Is it common? Is there any common feature between the 10 misstatements that he has discovered and he has discovered, and what is the cause, right? And then based on his analysis of nature and causal deviation and misstatement, he's going to project that misstatement on the entire population. Projecting is what? That if itna is the mistake in 10% sample, then what will be the misstatement with respect to the entire population? He's going to project it on the entire population. And last is what? Evaluating the results of audit sampling, that whether the conclusions that he have drawn, whether these are, appropriate or not. So this is the entire sampling process. Okay. Now let us just discuss these all these process one by one. So I told you that when the auditor is deciding the sample design, so in that case, he's going to consider what is the purpose of the audit procedure, what is the characteristics of the population. So all this auditor is going to keep in mind when he's designing any sample, right? So what is the specific purpose to be achieved? What is the combination of audit procedures that he's going to perform, right? What is the nature of audit evidence that he requires, right? And see, when the auditor is considering the sample design, he'll also keep in mind as to what is meant by a deviation with respect to this particular transaction, or what will be with respect to this particular internal control, or what is meant by misstatement. So the definition of what is the population, the characteristics of the population, the deviation, the misstatement, all should be clear to the auditor. whether that population is complete or not, auditor is going to consider, right? And the specific purpose that he wants to achieve, what audit procedures he wants to, apply. Based on this, auditor is going to decide the sample design. Is it clear? Is it clear, right? And see, students, let's say I am saying whether the population is complete or not. He is going to understand the deviation and the misstatement with respect to any internal control. Now tell me, if auditor expects that with respect to this particular internal control, the expected rate of deviation is unacceptably high. It is very high expected rate of deviation, that there is an expectation that this internal control is not working, operating effectively. Tell me, will auditor perform test of control? Will auditor, rely on that internal control? Quickly send in your replies. If the expected rate of deviation is high, I hope I have made my my question clear to you. So I'm saying that if the expected rate of deviation with respect to particular in control is high, right? So let's say during the year with respect to particular internal control, there has been certain changes that have been made, and the expected rate of deviation is very high. So will auditor rely on that internal control, or will he, just skip that testing of internal control and start checking in detail the financial statement? So in that case, auditor may, decide not to perform the test of control. Why? Because he may decide that I will not rely on that internal control because the expected rate of deviation is very high. Same way, if the expected rate of misstatement in a financial statement is high, so in that case, will auditor go for 100% checking or checking on sample basis? Quickly tell me. Quickly send in your replies. I am saying that if the auditor's expected rate of misstatement or expected misstatement in particular item of the financial statement, if it is high, that there is a high expectation of misstatement, tell me, will auditor check 100% of the transaction or go for sample checking? Send in your replies. So obviously auditor, yes, Tanu, you are correct. She's saying auditor will go for 100% checking. So that is why while designing the sample, what purpose, for the purpose you want to achieve, the audit procedures that you are going to apply, the nature of audit evidence you want, the deviation, what will constitute a deviation, what will be considered as a misstatement, whether population is complete or not, all this auditor is going to consider. Okay? So this is what your sample design. Now, the next point is what? Your sample size. And when we were discussing sample size, I told you that auditor will, select the sample size so as to reduce the sampling risk to an acceptably low level, right? Now, when the level of sampling risk the auditor is willing to undertake. So let's say the auditor is willing to undertake less sampling risk. So tell me, what will be the impact on the sample size? The sampling risk that the auditor is willing to undertake is less. So what will be the corresponding impact on the size of the sample? Will it be more or less? Quickly send in your replies. Yes, so the sample size will be more. So he wants less sampling risk. So that is going to have an impact on the sample size. That is, he's going to have a greater sample size, right? Now, what sample is to be taken? Again, statistical based formula or professional judgment. That is the statistical approach or the non-statistical approach. Now, there are various factors that are going to have an impact on the size of the sample. And we have seen that it can be with respect to test of controls. That is when the auditor is checking the internal control, as well as it can be with respect to test of details. That is when the auditor is checking the financial statement in order to find any misstatement at the assertion level. Now, quickly, let us discuss about test of controls. You just consider the situation, the factor that I'll explain to you, and then just write one, increase or decrease. That is, will auditor decide increase the sample size or will he decrease the sample size? So with respect to internal controls we are discussing, right? Now, if there is, greater reliance by the auditor on any particular internal control, so what will be the impact on the sample size? Will auditors select a greater sample size, or a, or a smaller sample size? So if there is an increase in the extent to which auditor's assessment takes into account the relevant control, that is, if the extent of reliance by the auditor on an internal control, that is, the internal control is there, let's say with respect to sales transaction, and he is going to rely on that internal control, and that extent of reliance on that particular internal control is high. So what will be the impact? Will the sample size increase or decrease? Check your answers, students. I'm saying that auditor is going to place more reliance on a particular internal control when he is, checking that financial statements, right? Tell me, will he check that internal control, the sample size will increase or will it decrease? Rihana, correct. Others also please reply. So I'm getting mixed replies with respect to this. So let me explain this to you. So let's say with respect to sales transactions, okay, I have decided when I was performing my risk assessment procedures, I decided that I'll be relying on the internal controls, right? But when under SA 330, I'm performing test of control. So before relying on that internal control, I'm testing that internal control. But I'm sure that my reliance will be there. Now tell me, will I, just check that internal control in detail, or will I check it with a very smaller sample size? Based on the fact that in future when I'm going to check the financial statements with respect to that particular internal control, I'm going to rely on that internal control. See, obviously I'm going to take a larger sample size. Why? Because I want more assurance with respect to that particular internal control, because I am going to rely on that particular internal control. So let me just take you through the module for this. So page number 4.57. So see, it says that other things being equal, the greater the reliance the auditor places on operating effectiveness of control in the risk assessment, the greater is the extent of auditor's test of control. And therefore, the sample size is going to increase and the sample size will what? Increase. So more the reliance I'm going to place on the internal control. So obviously, I would like to be sure about that internal control. So my sample size with respect to that particular, see, the sample size of that internal control I'm talking, I'm not saying the sample size of the financial statement. I got it why you are giving me mixed replies. See, my question to all of you is that we are discussing the factors influencing the sample size for test of controls. So when the auditor is checking the internal control, checking of the internal control he is doing on sample basis, and in fact it is always done on sample basis because auditor is not giving his opinion on the internal control as such. But since he intends to rely on that internal control, he's checking that internal control whether they are operating effectively or not, right? Now, with respect to that particular internal control, I'm taking a sample. So I'm not talking about financial statements on which that internal control is there. I'm checking the internal control only. Now, with respect to that internal control, what will be the impact on the sample size of that internal control, right? So if my reliance on internal control will be more, I'm going to take up a, greater sample size. Right? I hope I am able to make it clear to all of you now. Quickly tell me, is it clear? more reliance. Sunil, I'm saying reliance. So since I'm going to use that internal control when I'm going to perform my substantive procedures, so now when I'm checking my internal controls, with respect to that internal control, I'm going to take a greater sample size. So Tanu is saying clear. Sejal, you also reply. Sunil, you also reply. Jayendra, Prem. So I'm talking about the internal controls only. Okay. So now students are saying it is clear. Prem is saying clear. Sunil saying clear. Jayendra saying clear. Right? So Abhi, don't go for test of details. We are talking about your this test of controls, right? Now, if there is increase in tolerable rate of deviation, so with respect to a particular internal control, you as an auditor, you decides that I'll tolerate a higher deviation rate also. That is also fine to me. A higher deviation rate is acceptable. So increase in tolerable rate of deviation. So what sample size of that internal control? You are going to take. So Almas, you are absolutely correct. So auditor may take a smaller sample size. So decrease in sample size. An increase in expected rate of deviation of the population to be tested. So if the auditor has an expectation that this internal control, maybe there is what, and the expected rate of deviation is high, obviously he's going to check it in detail. So if it is unacceptably high, that it is not operating effectively, auditor may decide not to check it. That is the different situation. So if I say that there is an increase in the expected rate of deviation, obviously the impact that is it going to have on the sample size is going to be more, right? An increase in auditors' desired level of assurance that the tolerable rate of deviation is not exceeded by actual rate of deviation in the population. That is the desired level of assurance with respect to a particular internal control. If it is high, tell me what will be the impact on the sample size. Just write 4 and your answer. Sejal, please reply. 4 and your answer. Almas, Jendra, Sunil, Prem, Tanu, Rihana, Dhanush. Please send in your replies. Sunil, correct. So more reliance or more assurance I want. Obviously, in order to have more confidence, I'm going to increase my extent of checking of that internal control. Right? Clear? Is it clear? So it will be what? More. So Tanu, correct. Sunil, correct. Right? And then an increase in the number of sampling units in the population. So let's say there is an increase in the number of sampling units. So it may have a, negligible effect. Negligible effect on the sample size. Right? So maybe with respect to internal control, see, with respect to a very small population, I may go for 100% checking. But when there is increase in the number of sampling units, see, you have decided that with respect to sales, I'm going to check 500 sales transaction, right? You are checking the internal control with respect to, let's say, 100 sales transaction, right? Now there is an increase in the number of sales transactions. So this may not have any impact on the sample size that you have already selected with respect to your internal control on that particular sales transaction, right? So I hope this is clear. So when there is a greater reliance on the internal control, you are going to check this in detail. So more sample size. If your increase in tolerable rate of deviation is there, then a smaller sample size will be fine. Increase in expected rate of deviation, more sample size. Increase in your desired level of assurance, your confidence with respect to that particular internal control, more sample size. And an increase in the number of sampling units in the population may not have any, may have any negligible effect on the uh, sample size with respect to that internal control. Is it clear? On the same way, like on the same lines, see, Rihanna is saying, ma'am, what is the difference between tolerable rate of deviation and the expected rate of deviation? See, students, expected rate of deviation is, let's say, based on my assessment of risk of material misstatement, based on my past experience, I'm aware that this internal control is not operating effectively. So expected rate of deviation, I expect based on, let's say, my professional judgment, my understanding about internal control, my assessment of risk of material misstatement, my previous experience. So this is what I expect out of an internal control, that whether it is expected to operate effectively in preventing or detecting and correcting material misstatement at the assertion level. So whether, you know, it is, what is the expectation of the auditor, right? What is you then the next question is, what the tolerable rate of deviation? So for I hope, Rihanna, expected rate of deviation is clear to you. Quickly send in your replies. Expected rate of deviation, what an auditor expects out of the internal control, whether it is going to operate effectively or not, right? So Rihanna is saying clear. Now with respect to your next doubt relating to the tolerable rate of deviation, so I would like all of you to come to page number 4.67, whereby this definition is given: tolerable rate of deviation. So tolerable rate of deviation basically says that if let's say uh, if any internal control is there, if there is a deviation, this much deviation is fine for the auditor. But any deviation beyond that is there, I'm not going to rely on that internal control. So I'm not talking about my expectation. I'm saying how much deviation I, as an auditor, I'm going to tolerate. Any deviation beyond this point, I'm not going to tolerate. What is meant by I'm not going to tolerate? I'm not going to, let's say, rely on this internal control. So what is tolerant rate of deviation? A rate of deviation from prescribed internal control procedures set by the auditor, right? In respect of which auditor seeks to obtain an appropriate level of assurance that the rate of deviation set by the auditor is not exceeded by the actual rate of deviation. So let's say any internal control is there. So in a very simple terms, if I say there are CCTV cameras, right? So I expect that these CCTV cameras operate throughout the year. Expected rate of deviation, let's say, or out of the 365 days in a year, expected rate of deviation is 2 days. On 2 days, these CCTV cameras will not work, right? Now, tolerable rate of deviation, it means that if these CCTV cameras, let's say, they are not working on 4 days, that is fine by me. But if these are not working by 5 days, that is not fine by me. What I'm going to tolerate as an auditor. Is it clear, Rihanna? So if there is no reliance on the internal control sigil, I may not perform test of control. See, when the auditor is checking the internal control, whether, or the financial statement, whether he has to apply checking of all the transaction specific items or audit sampling, it all depends upon auditor's professional judgment. There is no obligation on the auditor to, go opt for audit sampling only, right? But when he is following audit sampling, then SA 530 will come into picture. Is it clear, Sejal? So if it is not relying on the internal control, he is not going to check the internal controls. He is straightforward going to, perform the substantive procedures. And based on his assessment of risk of material misstatement, he may extend the, his checking of substantive procedures. Clear, Sejal? Sejal is saying, ma'am, it is clear. Now let me see. Rihanna is saying, ma'am, it is clear. So Prem wants me to explain point number 2, 3, 4, which so Prem, I hope now these points must be clear to you. 2, 3, 4. Because I have discussed them again, right? Or let us do one thing. Let us now discuss the same factors with respect to misstatements in the financial statement. I'm sure that once you have an understanding about these factors, your understanding of factors relating to internal control is also going to be clear. Still, in case still there will be any doubt, you can send in your query again. So now the next topic is what? The example of factors influencing the sample size for test of details. So we are now here not talking about what the internal control. We are saying that with respect to test of details. So now let us take the example of sales transactions. You are checking the sales transaction, and now what are the factors? What is the impact or the effect of the factors? These factors on the sample size, right? So if there is an increase in auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement, auditor assesses that the risk of material misstatement with respect to these particular sales transaction is high. Tell me the sample size will be more or less. Quickly send in your replies. Will it be more or less? Just write one, more or less. Dhanush correct, Tanu correct, Rihanna correct. Others also. Sejal, please reply. Sunil, Prem, please reply. So there is an increased assessment of risk of material misstatement. What will be the impact on the sample size? So Prem is saying more, Sejal is also saying more. So absolutely correct. Now, if there is increase in the use of other substantive procedure directed at the same assertion. So let's say with respect to a particular assertion, you are applying two, three procedures, and you are able to obtain, audit evidence with respect to the other audit procedures also. Now, let's say with respect to this particular audit procedure, now whether your sample size will be more or less. By applying other audit procedure also, you are able to obtain audit evidence. So when you are applying a particular audit procedure, will the sample size be more or less? Quickly send in your replies. Will it be more or less? Just write two and your answer. Tanu correct, Prem correct, Almas correct. See, you are already in a position to, obtain audit evidence by performing some other audit procedure also. But let's say if you have to, perform this audit procedure, you may select a smaller sample size. Sejal correct. Okay. Increase in the auditor's desired level of assurance that the tolerable misstatement is not exceeded by actual misstatement in the population. So I hope now tolerable rate of deviation and misstatement is clear to you. So let's say so now try to understand tolerable and expected with respect to misstatement. So out of 1 lakh transaction, so let's say 10 lakhs is the amount of those transactions. So expected rate of deviation is what? Auditor expects that there can be a misstatement of 20,000, right? Tolerable rate of misstatement can be what? Till this amount, till 15,000, it is fine by me. So somewhat relating to your materiality levels, but any misstatement beyond this is not acceptable to me. Is it clear? Is it clear, Rihanna, now? So tell me, when there is an increase in desired level of assurance, will auditor check more transactions or less? So will there be a greater sample size or less? So Sunil, correct. Others also, please reply. Just write three and your answer. Yes, Sejal, you are correct. Your understanding is correct so far as second point is concerned. So with respect to second point, Sejal is saying since the other audit procedures are giving the results with respect to same assertion, yes. So with respect to this audit procedure, I may reduce the sample size. Now with respect to third point, Tanu correct, Almas correct, Sunil correct. So what was the point? That if the desired level of assurance is like auditor needs more confidence, so obviously more checking will be required, right? Increase in sample size basically means what? Increase in the extent of checking. That's it. Okay. And increase in tolerable misstatement. That okay, I'm going to, accept this misstatement. So there is an increase in that level of tolerable misstatement. So auditor may go for a lower, sample size. Okay. Then increase in amount of misstatement that auditor expects. So the expected misstatement is high. So obviously auditor is going to increase his level of checking, that is increase in the sample size, right? Stratification of this population. So this I'll take up whenever I'll be discussing with you stratification. And then if there is a change in the number of sampling units, so basically it says that if the population is very small, then auditor may not go for sampling. But as such, this is going to have what? Negligible effect on the sample size. Is it clear? Is it clear, students? Tell me. So I have written these points in short here, but in your module, I'll just show you as to how these points are given. So the entire explanation is also given. So if you just, give a reading once or twice, I'm sure it is going to be very much clear to all of you. Tell me, is there any doubt? Sunil is saying clear, Tanu is saying clear, Sejal is saying clear. Others also please reply, is there any doubt with respect to this topic? So this is what the factors that may have an impact on the sample size. Is it clear? So when we were discussing this topic, we saw that there is what? Sample design that we have considered, that we have done. Then there was sample size. Now the next topic is what? Selection of items for testing. So let me just take you through this. So we have done sample design, sample size. Now it's sample selection, right? So sample selection. So be it statistical or non-statistical approach, first and foremost, the auditor is going to select the sample in such a way that each sampling unit in the population has an equal chance of selection, right? So see, when the auditor is using statistical sampling, in that case, though, since we are using mathematical laws and probability theory, each sampling unit has a known probability of being selected, right? However, in case of non-statistical sampling, since judgment is used to select the sample, it might be possible that all the entire sample is not representative of the entire population, right? And in order to draw reasonable conclusion, when the auditor is, applying non-statistical sampling that is based on his experience and knowledge, he should, take a reasonable basis in order to ensure that the sample is representative and the bias should be avoided. So it should not happen that when the auditor is following non-statistical sampling, what he does is out of 1 lakh transaction, he makes sure that the transaction between the company and let's say few related parties, those are not selected. So then it means there is bias. And this is possible when the auditor is using non-statistical approach, because statistical approach mein the auditor is not applying his professional, his personal knowledge or experience. He's using the computers, he's using the formulae, and based on that, the sample is going to come. But when he's, applying his judgment only, that is non-statistical sampling, then he should ensure that there should not be any bias, right? So what is an example of bias with respect to the example that we were discussing? So I told you that. So it should not happen that out of all the sales transaction, auditor every time avoids the transaction that have been made to the related parties. So that means bias is there. Bias is there. Okay? Is it clear? Is it clear? Now, when the auditor is selecting the items for testing, there can be various methods, which are random sampling, systematic sampling, monetary unit sampling, haphazard sampling, and block sampling. And out of all these methods, random sampling, systematic sampling, and your haphazard sampling, these are the principal methods that are being used, right? So what are these methods? We are going to discuss them one by one in detail, right? So before discussing this, I would like to discuss a topic that I have left, that is stratification and value weighted selection, right? So before that, just tell me whether whatever we have done, whether it is clear or not. Quickly send in your replies. So I have left a topic of stratification and value weighted that I'll just cover. before starting with these explanation of these methods. So we are on page number 4.55 of your module. So stratification. So what is meant by stratification? So students see basically, so let's say the auditor is, having the sales transactions ranging from rupees 500 to rupees 10 lakhs. Rupees 500 to rupees 10 lakhs, right? Now, out of these transaction, the number of transaction is 1 lakh. This is the number, right? And the range is starting from, or you can say 5,000 to 1 lakh, 10 lakhs, right? Now, out of this, he selects a sample of 10%, right? So, if he's not applying stratification, a sample will be selected out of all these 1 lakh number of transaction, and chances are there, it can be possible that only the transactions which are, lower in value, those get selected, right? It can be possible. So what is to be done in a situation whereby the population is different? So the range is different now from 5,000 to 10 lakhs. So what auditor can do in order to ensure that the sample selected is representative of the entire population, or let's say the sample is selected in such a way that only the higher value item gets selected. So as such, it is not representative of the entire population, and this is our very purpose, that the sample should be representative of the entire population. So what can auditor do is, he can divide this entire population into stratas, that is groups, that okay, from 5,000 to, let's say, 1 lakh, this is one group. From 1 lakh 1 to, let's say, 3 lakh, this is one group. From 3 lakh 1 to 5 lakhs, this is one group. 5 lakh 1 to, let's say, 8 lakhs, this is one group. 8 lakh 1 to 10 lakhs, this is one group. Now, out of each group or each strata, auditor selects a sample. The sample that he selects now, is it a representative of the entire population? Quickly send in your replies, yes or no. Is it a representative of the entire population? Uh, Quickly send in your replies. Yes, now it becomes representative of the entire population. So what is meant by stratification? You are dividing a population into discrete subpopulation. What is meant by discrete? Discrete is what? Separate subpopulation, right? So we are on page number 4.55, right? So dividing the population into discrete, separate subpopulation which have identifying characteristics is called stratification. Each subpopulation is called stratum, and units under subpopulation are referred to as strata, right? Now, when you are applying the audit procedure, you are going to apply the audit procedures on the, strata, and you are going to project the results of that particular strata on the group to which it pertains, right? Not on the entire population, but on the particular item to which the particular group to which it pertains. Is it clear? Let me just take you through the module once for the explanation of this in detail. So just a minute. So see, stratified sampling. So basically, this is page number 4.61 of your module. So it says that this method involves dividing the whole population to be tested in few separate groups called strata and taking the sample from each of them. Each stratum is treated as if it is a separate population, and if proportionate of items are selected from each of these stratum. The number of groups into which the whole population has to be divided, it depends upon auditor's professional judgment, right? So for example, let's say there is a balance of what ranging from 525 to 10,50,000. So the range is high. So what auditor can do is he may go for stratification. That is, he may divide that population into the following categories. That is balance in excess of 10 lakhs, balance in the range of 7,75,001 to 10 lakh, balance in the range of 5,50,001 to 775, balance in the range of 2,25,001 rupee to 5,50,000, and balances 2,25,000 and below, right? Now, from each stratum, auditor may pick up a sample whereby he decides that, okay, with respect to this, since these are high value, I'm going to check all the transaction. With respect to these, let's say I'm going to check 25 of the transaction. With respect to this, I'm going to check 10% of the transaction. Let's say with respect to this, I'm going to check 2% of the transaction. Let's say with respect to this, I'm going to check 1% of the transaction. Now, see, the sample that he's going to check, that is going to be representative of the entire population, right? So when the data is highly diversified, that is, the range is high enough from 525 to 10 lakhs in this case. And the example that we took is what, 5,000 to 10 lakhs, right? So the range is high, right? And when such diversified data is there, auditor may go for what? Stratification. I hope stratification is clear to all of you. ठीक है? Now, what is meant by value weighted? So when now let us come back to this, and in fact just read about this stratification. See, it says that audit efficiency may be improved if auditor stratifies a population by dividing it into discrete subpopulation which have an identifying characteristics, right? And the objective is to reduce the variability of items within each stratum and therefore allow sample size to be reduced without increasing the sampling risk, right? Right. See, if auditor is not going from for stratification, so in this case, in order to reduce the sampling risk to an acceptably low level, auditor may have to, select a larger sample, right? But since now stratification is there, and stratification makes sure that the sample he'll select each and every item, like uh, item from each and every population, each and every subpopulation is going to come. So auditor may, select a smaller sample size, that, okay, with respect to each subpopulation, two samples I'm going to take. 10 transactions I'm going to take, that is going to be representative of the entire population. Now consider another situation whereby 1 lakh transactions are there and auditor is not opting for stratification. The range is high. In such a situation where there is no stratification been adopted by auditor, he will have to choose a larger sample size in order to make sure that sample becomes representative of the entire population. But when you just make subpopulations, it becomes even by selecting a smaller sample size, it can be a true representative of the entire population. Is it clear? Now what is your next type of selection? That is value weighted selection. So basically when the auditor is going for value weighted selection, so when the auditor is performing the test of details, okay, so what auditor does is, with respect to each monetary units, so let's say there are total sales of 10 lakhs and this is what rupees. So now 1 rupee, each rupee is going to reflect a monetary unit. So auditor is having what? 10 lakhs monetary units, right? So the auditor selection of the sample, the determination of sample size, and the evaluation, everything is conducted in monetary amounts, right? So here, instead of considering the physical units, that I have 1 lakh transaction in numbers, what I'll be saying, I'm having, since the total amount of your sales transaction is rupees 10 lakhs, so I'll be saying what? I'm having 10 lakh monetary units. And when selecting the sample size. I am selecting the sample. I'm evaluating the results. Everything will be based on the monetary amounts. Physical units I'm not going to consider, right? So I will, select one starting point. I'll then calculate the cumulative data as to where this monetary unit fall, and I'll select that particular invoice, right? So certain formulae are there which as such you are not required to do, but just keep in mind that when in case of value weighted selection, the sample size, its selection and evaluation will result in conclusion in monetary terms. So when performing test of detail, it may be efficient to identify the sampling units as individual monetary units that make up the population. Having selected the specific monetary units within the population, the accounts receivable balance, the auditor may then examine the account receivable balance. The auditor may then examine the particular items, for example, individual balances that contain that monetary unit. So cumulatively, auditor is going to, see as to where that particular value falls, and then he's going to select that particular invoice. Okay? Is it clear? So this was the topic which I wanted to cover before, starting with the various methods of your sample selection methods. This value weighted and stratified, this is going to come again. So there also we are going to discuss. And Rihanna, your doubt with respect to the factors, I'll summarize it. Let me just finish up with this entire essay 530, and then whenever I'll be summarizing the entire essay, I'll definitely summarize that also. Tell me, is it clear? Okay. So students will do one thing. We'll take a quick break of 15 minutes here, and after the break, we will start with this sample selection methods. Okay. So quick break of 15 minutes here. So I hope students, you all are back after the break. So Tanu, I'll check that. And Sejal, just students, you need to refer to the module that is given on your BOS knowledge portal. So Sejal, please check why in your module the matter is coming different of what I am sharing, because this is the module that is given on your BOS knowledge portal, right? So we were discussing what the sample selection methods. So the various sample selection methods are what? Your random sampling, systematic sampling, monetary unit sampling, haphazard sampling, and block sampling, right? Now, what is meant by random sampling? So random sampling, it basically means that all items in the population have a known chance of selection, right? So you may use random number tables using the computers, or in fact on mobiles, you may generate, random numbers that if let's say out of 1,000, you have to select a sample. There are various apps, or just randomly you may generate 10 numbers that out of this 1,000, if 10 data I have to select, what will be those numbers? So you may get the numbers out of or random numbers table or any of the apps using your mobile phones also, right? So this will make sure that all items of the population have a known chance of selection, because you're not applying your judgment as such. Now you're using computers or the random number table, or any such device to generate the random number, and based on that random numbers you are selecting the data, right? Such random sampling can be simple random sampling or stratified sampling. So I hope stratified is clear, but though I'll just take you through this also from the module, right? So what is meant by simple random sampling? So basically, again, all items have an equal chance of selection, right? So you are using random number tables also. So basically, you're not stratifying the data. So whatever, let's say you have lakhs of transaction, out of that you want a sample of 500. Using the random number tables or your computers, you just generate the numbers, 500 numbers, and the invoice corresponding to those 500 number you select, right? You are not stratifying the data. So use of random number tables can be there. It is easy to use, and assures that auditor's bias is not affecting the selection, because you're not using your personal experience, right? Each item in the population is selected by use of random number table, either with the help of computer or picking up a number in a random way. Maybe the lucky draw, like from the drum, right? This method is considered appropriate where the population to be sampled consists of reasonably similar units, right? So let's say you have a population within the range of, so the invoice amounts are within the range of 55,000 to 2,25,000. So here you may go for, simple random sampling. But if you have the invoice ranging from rupees 525 to rupees 10 lakh 50,000, since here the data is diversified, you may go for what? Stratified sampling, right? So random sampling can be simple random sampling or stratified sampling. I hope simple random sampling is clear to all of you. Now, what is stratified sampling? So now we are discussing about this second example, that is when the data is diversified from 525 to 10 lakh 50,000, right? So in this way, so it basically says that here the population to be tested is divided into few separate groups called strata, and you take a sample from each one of them. Each strata is treated as a separate population. So let's say you select you select sample from this, right? So whatever results you are going to obtain with respect to this B subpopulation, you are going to project it on this population, not the entire population. The results of this 10%, you will project it on this. That if with respect to 10%, I'm getting a misstatement of 100 rupees, what, let's say the total number of transaction in this is 10,000. So what will be the impact on 10,000 transactions? So this way you are going to decide, right? So see, it is mentioned here. So it says that each stratum is treated as if it were a separate population, and if proportionate items are selected from each stratum, right? So example, I hope it is clear. Now just read that. So stratified sampling is just an extension of simple random sampling, right? So, again, here also, with respect to each stratum, each group, you will use random number tables or any such method to select the samples. Is it clear? Is random sampling clear to all of you? Right? So, personal bias is not there. Right? Now, the next is what? Interval sampling or systematic sampling, right? Interval sampling or systematic sampling. So here, students, let's say you have 10,000 units, right? Or 10,000 transaction, and you want a sample of 200, right? So considering the total number of items that are there in the population and the sample size that you want, you are going to calculate the sampling interval. So if let's say 10,000 is the total number of items in the population that I want to check, and 200 is the sample size that I want. So if you just divide it, you will get what? 50, 50, the interval comes out to be 50. So every 50th item you are going to select, right? Now, here, students, the first item will be selected using a random number table, right? So let's say out of the first 50, you use a random number that, okay, every 20, the first item that comes is, let's say, 30th. Now you'll add 50 to this 30. So first will be the 30th item. Then your interval is what? 50. So next will be 80th item, then 110th item, 80. Then again you will add 50. That is 130th item. Again you will add 50. That is 180th item, right? So systematic selection is a selection method in which number of sampling units in the population, that is 10,000 in our case, is divided by the sample size. So that is 200 in our case, to give us sampling intervals. So this way you derive at a sampling interval, right? For example, 50, and having determined the starting point. So starting point can be determined using random numbers so as to, avoid any bias within the first 50. So you may select a random number out of a drum or out of a computer or out of your using your phones, and let's say 30th item comes. Each 50th sampling unit thereafter is selected. So first is 30th item, adding 50, 80th item, adding 50, 130th item, adding 50, 180th, and so on, right? So, although the starting point may be determined haphazardly, the sample is more likely to be truly random if it is determined using the computerized random number generator or random number tables, right? Now, students, when you are applying this interval sampling, care should be taken that it should not happen that, let's say, you select every 50th item and the transactions are recorded in such a way that every 50th item pertains to, let's say, one particular trade debtor, right? It should not happen like that. So let's say if two accountants are recording the transaction, so it should not happen that when you are selecting every 50th item, the transaction recorded by, let's say, Mr. A is coming all the time, right? So what can be a solution to this? You may select two starting points, that with respect to, let's say, 10,000 was the transaction, with respect to the first 5,000 transaction, this is my starting point, 30th. Now after the 5,000 transaction sample has been selected, I'll again choose another random number and then restart this process of every 50th item. So selecting multiple starting points can be a solution, right? So it says that when the auditor is using systematic sample, auditor would need to determine that sampling units within the population are not structured in a way that the sampling interval corresponds with a particular pattern. So every 50th item should not be, let's say, a sale to a particular debtor. It should not happen like that, right? So it says that if accountant A is responsible to record all transactions in particular month and accountant B for next month, if this structure is same throughout the year and the auditor determines as his sample to check every transaction of alternate months, So the sample that is been selected, it is selected in such a way that alternate months ka transactions are coming. So in this way, the only transaction by one of the accountant will be come in the sample, right? Therefore, systematic sampling when chosen as a method should be carefully applied to bring together every type of transaction. Then, what is the solution? More than one starting point can be considered to minimize such risk. Is it clear? Right. To it elaborates it further, so you can get a question over this also, that when you're selecting a sample, this is happening, right? So transaction to a particular data or from a particular branch is coming, so what is the solution? You may select what? To multiple starting points. So to minimize the effect of possible known bias through a pattern in the population, more than one starting point may be taken. Multiple random starting point is taken because it minimizes the risk of interval sampling pattern with that of the population being sampled. Is it clear? So are you clear with the random sampling, which consists of simple random sampling and stratified sampling, and the next one, that is interval sampling or systematic sampling? Quickly send in your replies. Now the third one is your monetary unit sampling, which is the same as we have done the value weighted selection. So your sample size, your sample selection, and the evaluation result, each and everything is in what? Monetary amounts. So here you are not talking about the physical units that I have 1 lakh transactions, but you are talking about monetary units. That is, let's say 10 lakh transaction of sales are there, you will say that I have 10 lakh monetary units, right? If rupees 10 lakh sales transactions are there, so you'll say you have 10 lakh monetary units, and you are going to apply the formula or your calculation based on those monetary units, right? Haphazard sampling, as the name suggests, it is not any structured approach. You are not using any judgment. You are not even using the random number tables haphazardly without applying your judgment also. This data, this data, this data, this data, without applying any, judgment, right? Not using the random number tables also. Right. So haphazard selection, in which the auditor selects the sample without following a structured technique. Although no structured technique is followed, but see, ultimately auditor has to draw conclusion about the entire population. So he'll make sure that conscious bias should not be there. So it should not happen that when he is looking at the data, he's consciously skipping any of the data, that this though I'm not going to select or this though I'm going to select. So that conscious bias should not be there, right? So it says that although no structure technique is used, the auditor would nonetheless avoid any conscious bias or predictability. For example, avoiding difficult to locate items, or always choosing or avoiding the first and last entries on the page. That let's say the first and the last entries, there is a problem with respect to these entities, I'm not going to select these entries, I'm not going to select it, right? And obviously haphazard selection is not appropriate when using statistical sampling. Why? Because this is all haphazard. You are not using random number tables. This is not a structured approach. You are not even using judgment also. In a very haphazard way, you are just selecting the data, right? Is it clear? Right? Then the last is what? Block sampling. So see, student, what is block sampling? So let's say there is a sales, 10 lakh sales transaction. So what you do, you just select a continuous, block of 1,000 sales transaction. That this is my block of 1,000 sales transaction. These 1,000 transactions I'm going to check. So this approach should not be used now, because that block may consist of, the transactions pertaining to a particular characteristics which are not representative of the entire population as such, right? So this method involves selection of blocks of contiguous is what? Adjacent continuous items from within the population. Block selection cannot ordinarily be used in audit sampling, because most population are structured such that items in a sequence can be expected to have similar characteristics to each other, but different characteristics from the items that are there in the entire population. With respect to my sales transactions, I'm going to check the 1,000 transactions that fall in the month of September. Now, it can be possible that transactions that are there with respect to sales in the month of September, that was, let's say a peak period with respect to the sales. The transactions were the volume of transactions were very high, or vice versa. So as such, that period is not representative of the entire population, na? Right? Is it clear? So, for example, auditor may take first 200 sales invoice from the sales day book in the month. That every month, first 200. So he is going to what? He's selecting a block of the transactions and he is checking them. But it is not advisable to be used with respect to audit, right? So is it clear? So we have done all your methods: random sampling, systematic sampling, monetary unit sampling, haphazard sampling, and block sampling. Quickly tell me, is it clear? Now, what we were doing the sampling process. And now, though, I hope it is clear to all of you that sampling process can be used for test of controls and for test of details also. So we have done sample design, we have done sample size, sample selection method. Now, once the sample has been selected, now you're going to apply the procedures on the sample so selected. Now, how to apply the procedures, we are going to just see. So Dhanush is asking me to repeat haphazard sampling. So see, when we were saying that you are using random sampling, I was saying that you are using, the random number tables. You are using the computers or the key, or you can use your phones to generate the random numbers. So your bias as such is not there. Your experience, your knowledge, or your like you are not interfering in the selection of the sample, right? What is haphazard? See, haphazard is, let's say there are 1 lakh transaction and I just say that, okay, give me first invoice, then give me 525th invoice, then give me 600th invoice, give me 1000 invoice. So in a haphazard way, no structured form, without using any random number table, and not applying any judgment also, that first and last invoice of every year I'll take, at the end of the period I'll take. So that also I'm not considering. No structured approach, no judgment, no random number tables, haphazard way may, like, okay, give me this invoice also, this invoice detail also, this invoice detail also, this. So without applying in judgment, I'm just selecting anything. This can happen. So auditor uses such thing, that let's say there are hundreds travel invoices. So I'll just write on a paper that out of this 100 na, I'll make a sample that fourth invoice, 54th invoice, okay, give me 70th invoice and give me 86th invoice. So I'm not using any random number table. I'm not using any structured approach. I'm not using any judgment. Right. So I'm selecting it without following any, structure technique. Right. But yes, I'll make sure that, see, let's say if when I'm doing haphazard sampling, so out of that 100, I'm aware that near the end of the year, na, there are some certain problematic transactions. So let's say I say that give me all these documents, and I consciously try not to select the transaction at the end of the period. So it says that it should not happen. That the auditor would nonetheless, where is it? Nonetheless, avoid any conscious bias or predictability. For example, avoiding difficult to locate items, always choosing or avoiding the first and the last entries on a page. So this I'm not going to do. So is it clear? Dhanush, is it clear? ठीक है. Others also, do you have any queries? So Dhanush is saying it is clear, right? So the next point was are performing the audit procedures on the sample that we have selected, right? So we are on page number 4.64 of our module, right? So performing the audit procedures. So if you just look at this now, these are the 3 points whereby the steps as such are written, and the next 3 points are the example. Next 4 points. Okay. So how the auditor is going to perform the procedures? Just a minute. So see the sample that has been selected, auditor is going to perform the appropriate procedures. So whatever procedures auditor has to perform, see if you remember when we designed the sample, we have, considered as to what audit procedures the auditor is going to perform. So auditor will perform the appropriate procedure on each item selected, right? On each item selected. So let's say a few checks have been selected out of a sample of 1,000. 10 checks that were the payment of which was made has been selected. Now, when you selected one of the check based on, let's say, random sampling, you found that it is a cancelled check. So what will auditor do? He will select a replacement item. He'll remove that. After, though, he'll consider as to whether that has been cancelled properly or not. Why? Because professional skepticism is to be applied throughout the conduct of audit. That is, auditor needs to be alert throughout the audit. But let's say any of the audit procedure cannot be applied on the selected item, then he's going to perform audit procedure on replacement item. That is, he's going to select another sample, another item, and on that he's going to perform the audit procedure. But yes, with respect to that selected item on which he could not, apply the audit procedure, he's going to consider that. Now, when auditor is considering that, he'll see that whether it is a misstatement or a deviation. So deviation with respect to internal control or misstatement with respect to financial statement. So let's say if it is a cancelled check and everything has been done properly, so auditor will just, perform procedures with respect to that cancelled check and perform his procedures with respect to the replacement item. But now let's say any item, any check is there whereby, let's say, there is some misstatement, right? So auditor is going to consider it as a deviation with respect to the test of control or the misstatement with respect to the test of details, right? So it says that, let's say the selected item is a cancel check, then auditor should satisfy himself that whether the check was properly cancelled and it is not a deviation, right? And then he'll select a replacement item and that is a valid check, and then he is going to perform his audit procedure on that, right? Now, let's say auditor selects one of the items. So I told you that the first 3 points are relating to how you are going to perform the procedure. Rest are the examples. So we have discussed this first example of check. And then let's say you have obtained, you are checking the sales transaction. All credit sales you are checking. You selected the sample and out of that one is cash sale. So what will you do? You will perform, with respect to the cash sales, you are going to check that also. And you may perform, you may just, obtain other audit procedures, or sorry, you may obtain another item as a replacement item, right? Now, let's say with respect to external confirmation, you selected a sample, and with respect to one of the trade receivables, you are not getting the confirmation. So, as such, there is no requirement to select the replacement item. Why? Because this is not a deviation, this is not a misstatement. So, what auditor can do? He can perform alternative procedures, right? So, for example, he may examine the subsequent cash receipts, right? And if it is not possible to, perform the alternative procedures also, then auditor may consider it as a deviation or the misstatement depending upon his professional judgment. Let me just take you through the module for this. We are on page number 4.64 of your module. So it says that the auditor shall perform audit procedures appropriate to the purpose on each item selected. Simple. If the audit procedure is not applicable to the item, the auditor shall perform that procedure on the replacement items. For example, we took example of what cancel check. Okay, right? If the auditor is unable to apply the designed audit procedure or suitable audit procedure to a selected item. So take example of external confirmation. You selected that item, you did not receive the confirmation. You perform what alternative procedure? That is, you will check the subsequent receipts. Let's say thereafter also you're not able to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence with respect to that particular debtor. The auditor shall treat that item as a deviation from the prescribed control in case of test of control or misstatement in case of test of details. Is it clear? Is it clear? So you can just have a read at the four examples that are given. We have discussed all the examples. So another last example that is given in your module is that suppose you select all the transactions of computerized sales, but when you were selecting the data, any of the sale out in that sample, one sale that is done by manual billing, that also gets selected, right? So what will you do after checking the correctness of the manual bill along with this supporting documents available? You will see if there is any replacement item, you will consider that. Is it clear? Is it clear? So if I just say that what are the audit procedures? So first and foremost, you are going to apply the audit procedures on each item selected. Then if the audit procedures cannot be applied, then replacement item. And if you are unable to, apply the designed audit procedure or alternative audit procedure with respect to that selected item, then you may consider it as a deviation or a misstatement. So when you are, understanding this point, just keep in mind the cancelled check wala example. And when you are understanding this point, just keep in mind the external confirmation wala example. Is it clear? So performing the audit procedures. So this was another step of the sampling process. Then the next step is what? Nature and cause of deviation. So you saw that auditor will consider it as a deviation or a misstatement. So connected to this is what? Now you are going to consider what is the nature and cause of this deviation. Is any particular feature that is associated, let's say there are five misstatements that you come across, and you are not able to, perform any alternative procedures on that, and you determine that these are misstatements, right? Now you will see, is there any particular feature which is common between these misstatements? So let's say you find that these are the misstatement pertaining to a particular trade receivable, a particular account receivable. Now you are going to extend your audit procedure towards that particular feature, that is that particular account balance. Okay, is it clear? And you're going to investigate the nature and cause, right? So let us just have a look at this also from here only, right? So nature and cause of deviation and misstatement, and this is very logical, right? So while analyzing, auditor will observe, is there any common feature while analyzing what? Deviation with respect to test of control or misstatement with respect to test of details. Auditor is going to observe, is there any common feature? Like, is there any particular type of transaction or location or product line or period where this misstatement is coming? And auditor will identify all items in the population with that common feature. So let's say auditor finds that with respect to five transactions, there is a misstatement. Auditor finds that all those transactions were, or let's say all those transactions were entered into the system by Mr. A, right? So what will auditor do? So Mr. A. So what will auditor do? Now he will identify all the items that were processed by Mr. A, and he'll, extend his audit procedure to all those items, right? Or let's say all those items pertain to any particular trade receivable. So he'll take all the items with respect to that particular data, right? It may be intentional, and possibility of fraud co-auditor is going to see, right? Auditor will investigate the nature and causes of deviation or misstatement, and he will evaluate the possible effect on the purpose of the audit procedures and the audit. Possible effect on the purpose of audit procedure. So whether he's, able to achieve the audit objective of the audit procedure, and other areas of audit is whether it is going to have an impact on the risk of material, assessed risk of material misstatement, whether it is going to have an impact on the nature, timing, extent of audit procedures, everything the auditor is going to consider, right? Now, see, in extremely rare circumstances, it can be possible that auditor comes across anomaly. Auditors come across what? Anomaly. Now, what is anomaly? So it basically says, let's say any deviation misstatement is there, and auditor finds that there is a mistake, there is a error with respect to that particular misstatement pertaining to a particular data. Now let's say that is pertaining to that particular invoice only, and as such it is not representative of the entire population. So what is anomaly? It may be defined as misstatement or deviation that is demonstrably not representative of the misstatement or deviations in the populations. So it is not representative of the misstatement or deviations in the population. So let's say you have sent the confirmation request, and with respect to one debtor the confirmation request is not received, neither you are able to obtain any audit evidence by performing the alternative audit procedures. But let's say with respect to that particular debtor certain litigations are going on with respect to only that particular debtor, so that becomes what? Anomaly, right? That is, it is not representative of the entire population. That is why the definition says a misstatement or deviation that is demonstrably not representative of the misstatement or deviations in a population, right? So let's say if I generally give example of CCTV cameras, though it is not a financial control as such, but let's say the CCTV cameras on a particular day are not working throughout the day, right? But when auditor inquires, when he sees the natures and the nature and the cause of that deviation, since it is with respect to internal control, I'll say it as a deviation. Auditor finds that on that particular day there was a complete power failure of the entire region. So as such that particular day constitutes anomaly because it is not representing the entire year, that entire year this happens. Let's say that day, particular day, there was some catastrophe, there was some disaster because of which there was complete power failure in the entire region, right? So it is a misstatement or deviation that is demonstrably not representative of the misstatement or deviation in a population, right? Is it clear? So it says that when the auditor is analyzing the nature and cause of deviation, so first of all, we have seen auditor will see what is the common feature, right? And common feature, and based on that, he is going to identify all the items and extend his audit procedures to those items because it may be intentional, possibility of fraud can be there, right? He'll investigate the nature and cause of the misstatement and evaluate what is the effect on the purpose of the audit procedures and the audit, right? In extremely rare circumstances, auditor may consider any deviation or misstatement to be anomaly. To and with respect to that, see something, some deviation or misstatement was there. So in order to ensure that that deviation or misstatement is actually anomaly, auditor will have to obtain higher degree of certainty. Na? Auditor need to be sure that, okay, on that particular day, there was a power failure. On that particular day, or let's say with respect to this particular data, there is a litigation. That is why I'm not able to obtain any sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So auditor will obtain a higher degree of certainty that such, so I have written DM, so this is deviation or a misstatement is not representative of the entire population. How? By performing additional audit procedure to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence that such deviation or misstatement does not affect the remainder of the population. Is it clear? This term anomaly is really very, very important. Okay, so what is this? It is a deviation or misstatement, but it is not representative of the entire population. It is one of the rare and it may happen in extremely rare circumstances. So basically, let's say out of 365 days, one day some particular internal control was not happening due to some major something that has happened, and that particular day got selected as a sample. Okay, so it is not representative of the entire population. Let's say with respect to 1 lakh trade receivables, with respect to one particular debtor, some litigation are going on, no data is available. Let's say some the company has lost the data with respect to that particular debtor, and that data got selected in the sample. So it is not representative of the entire population. So it says it is not demonstrably not representative of misstatement or deviation in the population. Is it clear? Is it clear? So what were our next step? So we had sample design, then sample size, then selection of items, then performing the procedures, then nature cause of deviation, and then is your projecting the misstatements. Dhanush, what is not clear? Kindly be specific. Be specific in your queries. So I'll repeat it. So basically, auditor will perform the what was the topic? Nature and causal deviation. So while analyzing the nature and causal deviation, auditor will see, just a minute. This is not alimony. This is anomaly, right? That the misstatement or deviation is demonstrably not representative of the misstatement or deviation in a population. If that was the query, I hope it is resolved, Anush. I will not repeat this. Okay? Okay. Now the next topic is what? Projecting the misstatements. So now when the auditor has, considered the nature and cause of deviation, he has performed the audit procedure, right? So auditor is going to project the misstatement on the entire population, right? So let's say auditor says that if I'm getting a rupees 100 misstatement in a population of in a sample of 10%, that then what will be the misstatement if the entire what will can be the misstatement with respect to the entire population. So this way, auditor is going to project the misstatement on the entire population. See, students, in when the auditor is projecting the misstatement on the entire population, he'll obtain a broad view that okay, if there is a rupees 100 ka mistake in 10% of the population, there can be, let's say, 10,000 ka mistake in the 100% of the population. So this is giving a broad view. As such, exact amount auditor cannot derive. So the auditor is required to project misstatements for the population to obtain a broad view of the scale of misstatement. But this projection may not be sufficient to determine the amount to be recorded. So as such, exact amount cannot be derived, right? And see, students, now consider that misstatement. Let's say if that misstatement is what? Anomaly. If that statement is anomaly, see, you will not use that misstatement when you are projecting it on the entire population. Why? Because it is an exception, right? So while you're projecting the results that you have obtained on the sample on the entire population, you will not use that anomaly, right? But when you are calculating as to what is the extent of the misstatement, then if that anomaly is still uncorrected, you will consider that. So while you're projecting it on the entire population, you will not use that. Why? Because that is an exception. Though that is an exception, but it is a misstatement. So if you are calculating as to what is the total misstatement, then you are going to consider that if it is still uncorrected. Now read this second point with me, and then after reading this point, if you have any doubt, then send your queries. Abhi, just wait, right? So when a misstatement has been established as anomaly, it may be excluded when projecting misstatement to the population. You will not project it to the entire population because it is an exception. In extremely rare circumstances, something has happened. I'm not going to assume that it has happened for the entire population also, right? However, the effect of any such misstatement, if uncorrected, but if that is still uncorrected, it still needs to be considered in addition to the projection of the non-anomalous misstatement. So if you are seeing as to what is the total misstatement, so that anomaly plus your projected misstatement on non-anomalous misstatement. So non-anomalous misstatement are what? The misstatements which you have projected on the entire population. Is it clear? Right? And then the last point says that with respect to test of details, you are going to project that if in 10% sample rupees 100 is the mistake, then in 100% sample, what will be the mistake, right? However, in case of test of control, this 10% is going to help you. So no projection is required as such. So read this with me, then tell me if you have any doubt. For test of details, the auditor shall project misstatements found in the sample of the population, whereas for test of control, no explicit projection of deviation is necessary, right? Since the sample deviation rate is also the projected deviation rate of the population as a whole. Is it clear? Are the 3 points clear? And this is really very, very important. A 3 or 4 mark question can directly come with respect to projecting the misstatement, that you are conducting the audit of sales transactions. Everything has been done. You have, seen that there is one of the anomaly, how you will project the misstatement. So first and foremost, this is going to give you a broad view, but and yes, it is not possible to, sufficient to derive an amount to be recorded. Secondly, if there is any anomaly, that same shall be excluded when auditor is projecting the misstatements to the entire population. But the effect of such misstatement, if it is still uncorrected, it will be considered along with projection on non-anomalous misstatement. Clear? And last, it says with respect to test of details, you are going to project it on the entire population. However, since see, with respect to the, internal control, you will say 10% of the internal controls are not working, right? So that degree, that percentage, that is going to give you the rate that is there with respect to the entire population, right? So that is why it says no explicit projection or deviation is necessary, since sample deviation rate is also the projected deviation rate for the sample as a whole. Is it clear? Is it clear, students? And last is what? Evaluating the results of audit sampling. That is, auditor is going to evaluate the results of sample and whether use of sampling has provided reasonable basis for the conclusions about the population that has been tested. So whether the results are, reasonable or not with respect to the entire population, right? So what is meant by stratification? So the definition of stratification is given on page number 4.66. I hope it is clear. And then tolerable misstatement and tolerable rate of deviation. So tolerable rate of deviation, though I have discussed. Now let us just have a look at this definition. So tolerable misstatement is a monetary amount set by the auditor in respect of which auditor seeks to obtain an appropriate level of assurance that the monetary amount set by the auditor is not exceeded by the actual misstatement in the population. That is, let's say up to 10,000, if any misstatement is there, I'm going to tolerate. Beyond that, so actual misstatement should not exceed this tolerable rate of deviation, right? So with this, we have covered essay 530 also, which is the, the last left essay of this chapter, a very important chapter. I told you, the weightage is 12 to 18%. So I'll do one thing, as many of you were saying, I'll just quickly, take you through this entire essay 530. And then if the time will permit, I'll definitely take you through the questions with respect to this chapter, your past year questions. In case you have any query, please send in your queries. Yes, your query is not clear. Please reframe it. Please reframe your query, Yash. Okay. So we started with discussing audit sampling. So I'll take you through the module. And you, students, I always say that consider your module as the basis for, your detailed understanding and preparation for exams. Your notes you can always make the way you like. If you want to highlight the keywords, that is also fine. If you want to make the notes on the sides, that the blank sides that are there on the pages, that is also fine. You want to keep and register, that is also fine. But you will have to, write the keywords or make the notes. So that is going to help you in, revising your concepts at the time of your examinations, right? So we have seen that the routine checking, non-consequential routine checking, that is what illogical routine checking, whereby you're checking all the transaction, it should be avoided. So when, and as such, it is not obligatory for the auditor to follow audit sampling, but when he's following audit sampling, then SA 530 comes into picture. So it is what application of audit procedures to less than 100% of items within a population relevant under the audit, such that all sampling units have an equal chance of selection. What is the objective? To obtain a reasonable basis for the auditor to draw conclusions about the entire population from which sample is selected. It can be statistical approach, it can be non-statistical approach. And we have seen that since SA 500 it was given that one of the means of selecting items is what? Audit sampling. So SA 530 complements SA 500. Population should be appropriate, complete, and reliable. Sampling unit, I hope it is clear, and sample must be representative of the entire population. So you may get a question that you're following non-statistical approach, and the article clerk is of the opinion that since non-statistical approach is being followed, so the sample may not be representative. So it is not true. Sample should be representative, be it statistical approach or non-statistical approach. So approaches, I hope clear that with respect to statistical, there is what random selection of sample items, probability theories to evaluate the sample results, and probability theory, including what your measuring of the sampling risk that the auditor is going to, take, right? And it is more scientific, mathematical laws are there, large number of transactions it is going to help, and no personal biases there. Non-statistical is personal experience and knowledge, though auditor also tries that there should not be any specific pattern for selection of the, sample, right? What is sampling and tradition? I've given this as a homework for you to read, and these are the points, that is factors that are going to affect the extent of checking. So size of organization, state of internal control, adequacy, reliability of books and records, tolerable error range, and degree of desired confidence, right? So advantages of statistical is what? The amount of sample size does not increase with increase in the population, or the area, universe word has been used, that is to be tested. The sample selection is objective and defensible. So you can decide the minimum sample size corresponding to the specific risk and precision. Precision is what? Accuracy. Calculated risk and the corresponding precision can be calculated. Better description of large amounts of data is possible, and personal bias is not there, right? So widely accepted. The methods, the sampling process, we have seen it can be with respect to test of control as well as with respect to test of details. So sample design, then sample size, selection, audit procedures, nature, cause of deviation, and misstatement, and projecting misstatement, and evaluating the results of audit. So here I would like to, discuss this table with you in detail, because this was doubt of one of the students. So this I'll take up from my notes. So this is basically the factors that have an impact on the sample size, right? So we have seen that with respect to test of control, if there is an increase in the reliance on the internal control, so you are going to rely more on that internal control. So when you have to check whether that internal control is effective or not, with respect to that internal control, you will take a higher sample size, right? So just remove this, don't get confused. Okay. Then if there is increase in tolerable rate of deviation, there will be decrease in the sample size, increase in expected rate of deviation. So you are expecting that there can be greater deviation. So you are going to check that in detail, right? So basically, see, more the assurance is required, more work auditor has to do. That is bigger sample or increase in sample size, right? So the next is increase in auditor's desired level of assurance, more sample size, bigger sample size, increase in number of sampling units. This is going to have a negligible effect. Same way with respect to test of details, if the risk of material misstatement assessed is higher, obviously more checking, that is more sample size. Increase in use of other substantive procedure directed towards same assertion. So you are able to obtain audit evidence with respect to that assertion from other procedures also. So you may take a lesser decrease in the sample size will be there. If you want more assurance, more work, more sample size. If there is increase in tolerable misstatement, ki misstatement hai to I'll tolerate that. Itna misstatement hai, I'll tolerate that. Less checking will be fine. Increase in the amount of misstatement that auditor expects. Expectation kya hai ki more misstatement can be there with respect to sales. Obviously, I'm going to check more of that. Stratification. Now I hope it is clear how stratification is going to reduce the sample size. I hope it is clear now. And then the number of sampling units that are there, that is there in the population, that is going to have a negligible effect. Is it clear? So with that, we have finished the entire chapter. And students, see, I have discussed with you this entire chapter, including each and every I have tried to cover all the questions, all the topics that are there, right? And in fact, on page number 4.67, there are 3 tests for understanding, 4, 5 and 6. So though I'm not able to, discuss that, but you just do it as a homework. These are pertaining to your essay 600. So students, at the end, I would like to, repeat that this is a really very important chapter. Percentage is, the weightage is 12% to 18%. I understand that this is a lengthy chapter, but if you just, bifurcate this chapter as to how many essays you have to do, and you prepare it essay wise, you are going to, find this, the preparation of this chapter and understanding of this chapter really very simple. So do not go by pages, just go by the essay numbers, that these are the essay numbers I have to cover, and then I'll cover all these essay numbers, right? So let me just have a look at the queries. So Dhanush is saying, ma'am, for any of the auditor is, going for sample audit by sampling is beneficial. What is the word that you have written? Is better, or checking the 100% transaction. So students, it all depends upon the auditor's professional judgment and whether it is possible for the auditor to check all the transactions, right? Are only 10 or 100, let's say 50 transactions, a small organization is there. So let's say with respect to that, other example, any sales transactions is there, those are made to related party. So with respect to those sales transaction, if all transactions are being made to related party, auditor may not go for audit sampling. He may check all the transactions in detail, right? So it all depends upon the particular assertion that auditor is going to check the the risk of material, right? And if, let's say, it is not practically possible for the auditor to check all the transactions in detail, so he will have to go for, as to whether he can rely on internal control. What is his assessment of risk of material misstatement? Is it clear? Dhanush, is the doubt clear? Tanu, I'll check regarding the notes. I'll check that. So a PPT will be uploaded with respect to which will be summarized, which will summarize the entire chapter. I hope all your queries are resolved now, students. Quickly send in your reply if you have any queries. So I really wanted to discuss the past year questions of this chapter. And in fact, let us discuss just one or two questions. Just one or two questions. So if you just look at the screen, this is the November 22 question. So it says that as per essay 520 analytical procedures, what are the examples of analytical procedure having consideration of relationship? See, this is such a direct question. So the essay number is also mentioned, the name is also mentioned, a 3-mark question is there, and this is just asking you for the relationship. And if you remember, we have done that it can be among the elements of financial information like the margin percentages, or it can be between the financial and relevant non-financial information through, your entire module. So, or let us just see. The objective of auditing is to design and perform audit procedures in such a way as to enable the auditor to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence to able to draw reasonable conclusions on which to base the auditor's opinion. This can be obtained by performing which procedures? Name the type of audit procedures the auditor can perform to obtain audit evidence. A 4 marks, such an easy question. It is asking about the various kinds of audit procedure and the names of audit procedure. So auditor may perform risk assessment procedure, further audit procedures. Further audit procedures can be test of controls, your substantive procedure. Substantive procedures can be test of details, your substantive analytical procedure. And the name are, you all know, ICAI, ORR, inspection, external confirmation. ICA is analytical procedure, I is inquiry, ORR is observation, replacement, and recalculation and reperformance. Is it clear? Are you able to, gain confidence after looking at these questions? So this is again a November 22 question. This is also November 22 question. See, what are the matters that the auditor shall consider when he's designing audit sample? Right? So if you remember, so it says that uh, when designing an audit sample, the auditor shall consider the purpose, okay? Then the characteristics of the population, right? And while he's designing the sample, he'll see the nature of audit evidence, the possible deviation. Remember that whether the population is complete or not, all these points. I hope you remember. Then this is May 23 question. The reliability of data is influenced by source and nature and is dependent on circumstances. Explain the factors that are relevant when determining whether the data is reliable for the purpose of designing substantive analytical procedure. So essay 520, right? So I hope students you are able to gain confidence. I'll share this screen also. So do you have any queries? These questions, yes, Rihanna, I'll upload these questions also on the BOS app. The question of last year's pertaining to this chapter. So students, any other queries you have? So that's it from my side. Thank you, students. And over to you, Ankita ma'am.
Thank you, Nancy ma'am, for this wonderful lecture. And students, you will get the notes of chapter 4 by tomorrow, the notes and the questions. So students, as of now, 4 of our chapters are completed in this batch. So before coming to next class, do practice of the questions. For descriptive question, you may refer model test paper book. There are 8 model test paper in that book. So do revision and solve the question in writing, not just reading, and then compare your answers with the solutions available in the model test paper book. And for the revision of case scenarios, your MCQ question, do refer case scenario booklet, which is also available in BOS Knowledge Portal. So in that, reasons are also available for your practice. Further, Saransh book is also available on BOS Knowledge Portal. For this is basically a summary book of your chapters. So the next class will be on Friday, which is 4th of April, in which we will be starting chapter number 5. So do revise all these chapters which are done and then come for the next class. Thank you, Nancy ma'am. Thank you all.
Okay, Ankita ma'am. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, students. Bye. Good evening.
Recording stopped.